with Clara Song Lee. Clara is a dear friend of mine. She is editor at Penguin Random House. She specifically works in the health and wellness sector of Penguin and Zeitgeist publishing. And I really wanted to have her on to kind of share her with the world, right? She was the editor that supported Erica and I in our book project, right? Our book, Overcoming Childhood Trauma. And we had many, many conversations that were very thought-provoking, enriching, and expensive, right? Those conversations really left me interested in the person, right? In Clara. And I wanted to know, how did she have so much knowledge about our field, right? What led her into the work that she does, and also a bit about how even in her own way she has to process her own work, right, to be able to edit some of these books that tend to have very heavy topics, right, and topics that in itself are healing, but at the same time hold a lot of burdens, right? Topics that can also trigger anyone if they haven't done their own work, right? So she was able to sort of talk about her processing her own history and how that has like supported her in her own work in being an editor, right? So we get to know her, get to know a little bit of her history and how did she get into the space of becoming an editor, right? And one thing that really stuck with me after our conversation was how we tend to hold things, right? And no matter who we are or what field we're in, we're constantly coming up against things. And how do we process those events, right? And how do we process those events? How do we process those transference that's happening in our own work, in our own space, right? Therapists, we tend to constantly look at transference in the room, right? So it's something that we're constantly reflective of. How am I showing up in the room? How is the client showing up in the room? What part of me it's coming across? What part of me I'm withholding? What part of them it's coming across? What part of them it's withholding? Things that we can see, things that we want to see, right? So there's this constant reflection on transference, right? Where the lay folks, they probably don't think about transference as much, right? But it's all around us, right? There is transfer from our parents to us. There's transfer from us to our kids, right? To the people that we love, people we are in relationship with. And of course, there is transference when we are engaging in meaningful work, right? Meaningful work that also can trigger our own history, right? How do we respond to something that can trigger our own history, right? And specifically with Clara, right, she talks about writing topics around mental health and and trauma and some of this stuff, right? And for her, knowing that this stuff can also trigger her parts of her own history, right? So this goes to show how important the work of transfer and reflection is for everyone, right? And it goes to show there's constant relationships and connections to different things around us, different things in our environment, and the need to process and reflect on those things, right? She talks about all the different books that she worked on, and what those books meant to her, right? She talked about our book, and she talked a bit about Morgan Johnson's book, Rebuilding Trust, um, and some of the great books that she worked on. So a little bit more about Clara. Clara Song Lee is a senior editor at Zeitgeist Division at Penguin Random House, where she works on practical nonfiction books about health and wellness. She is also a chair of the Bring Your Own Voice program for the POC at PRH Employee Resource Group, which creates a space for self-identifying BIPOC folks to have open and honest conversations about topics like imposter syndrome, microaggression, and more. I hope you guys really enjoyed the episode, and we'll try to have some more episode out soon. It's been I know I say this every time I release an episode, it's been a busy season. I have so many different episodes that we haven't released that. A part of me feels really, really bad that I haven't gotten a chance to release some of the episodes. Um, I know you guys will really enjoy Clara. Take care. Today we have Clara Lee with us. Again, I'm Sosnes Lima. I'm your host at House of Therapy Podcast. How are you doing today, Clara?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well. It's good to see you again.
Always great to see you too.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of the last time I saw you. Was it in June or over video?
It was definitely during the summertime, and I think you were asking questions about some editorial stuff that I had, like feedback for you, perhaps for one of the passes or something. And I think you had some questions around what to do with next steps or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and to kind of go into it a little bit. So Clara was the main editor on my book, right? I think I have it up here. This podcast is actually not to plug in my book, but I'll plug it for 2 seconds.
I'm always glad when you talk about your book because it is such an important book, and I think it's going to help a lot of people.
Overcoming your childhood trauma, right? And Clara, I think, man, it was a huge to have you on Erica and on our team and be able to write this book. So you're editor. So tell me tell us, right, the audience a little bit about yourself. What got you into this field and who you are.
So I am a Korean American woman who was born in Atlanta, Georgia, and I grew up there. And after college, graduating, I went to school in New York, and then after I graduated, I was a paralegal, and I was like, oh, I'm going to try to go to law school. But the work I was doing as a paralegal was super busy. I never had time to study for my LSATs or work on my applications because I was there during 9/11, and the firm that I was working at represented Larry Silverstein, who was the World Trade Center, I guess, landlord or something, and he was suing the insurance companies for money to use to rebuild. And so that was super stressful. And I wound up moving to South Korea because one of my friends was like, oh, you know what? Like, I have a friend who was teaching English there. Super fun. All he does is party. It's really easy. You get paid well. And I was like, oh, that sounds cool. And because of the style of parents I have, they were always like, when are you going to law school? Like, you have to go to law school because, you can't be a successful immigrant child if you don't have a postgraduate degree. So I told them, well, what if I went to Korea and learned about our culture? And they were like, okay, I think we might be okay with that because I think they wanted me to learn about Korean culture. My Korean is not very strong. They thought, oh, maybe I'll pick up more Korean. So I went there thinking I would, be there for 1 year teaching English and partying. But then I wound up staying for 7 and went from teaching into the content development side, working on textbooks and workbooks for the company. Okay. And then from there, while I was there, I met my now husband because he was backpacking through Asia and stopped through Korea, and looked me up on Facebook and was like, oh, do you remember me? I used to work with my sister. And we started hanging out and dating, and he's a software engineer, and I had friends who told me that they thought I would like the Bay Area because I'm very progressive, and neither of us wanted to go back to New York, so we moved to the Bay Area, and then that's where I wound up working as a book editor at a publishing startup. And then I was there at this publishing startup for about 7 years before I moved to Penguin Random House, and I've been at Penguin for over 3 years, I think, and that's where I currently work. And the kind of work I do is I help so we have a data team that will give us ideas on books and markets that have space for another book, and then we as editors will research this book's market and then try to develop what we feel is like the perfect competitor. And so one of the topics that I was given was trauma, and childhood trauma was an area that I thought there are a lot of readers who want more support in working through and processing. And so that's how I worked with you to develop this childhood trauma workbook that you have now holding in your hands. And so that's how it happened.
Yeah, yeah. Can I ask you a little bit more about your background?
Yeah, sure.
So 9/11 in New York.
Yeah.
Were you in school at the time, or you were working? So you were working.
I was working as a paralegal.
Okay.
Yes, I was living in Brooklyn.
Okay. Okay.
And I remember that day very clearly.
Okay. Yeah. So I went to this training, and I'm a sort of go off topic, kind of come in. So I went to this training years ago from this therapist at NYU, and she talked a little bit about the experience of 9/11, right? And she talks a bit about how when it happened, she had her office is in Lower Manhattan somewhere, and when it happened, right, she was in session with another client, right, and to have this sort of experience, this traumatic experience that happened at the same time with your client, right? And that's a whole situation to kind of be able to process. Like, me and this person, me and this client have had the same traumatic experience, right? And we hold the same sort of things. And it's something that's very interesting, right? And she has written and talked a little about that. So I know for me, being trained as a therapist in New York City is something that I always was like cognizant of. Like, where were you in 9/11? How was that for you in 9/11?
Yeah.
Right. So like to even bring that up, right? How was that for you and everything? I don't want to just kind of skip over all of that.
It was a very... So now that I'm older, I can recognize that I think I was very dissociated when that whole thing happened. I was also... Back when I was in my early 20s, I had just been recently diagnosed with ADHD, and had a history of had a history of depression and anxiety when I was younger, and I was seeing a therapist, but I was very, very not ready to do the work. Like, at one point, my therapist was like, "Why are you here?" Because I was so mad about being there, and I was like, "I don't know, why am I like." I think someone had said that if I wanted to get my ADHD medicine, I needed to see a therapist. I think that was it. And I was just like, I just need my medicine so I can go be a workaholic at my job. And so I was not emotionally, I think, very intelligent. And so when 9/11 happened, the first thing I did was I woke up, and I used to have my TV be my alarm clock because that was the only way I could wake up. And I remember the news was on, and they were freaking out about some plane that hit one of the buildings, and I just remember thinking oh my god, I can't believe some idiot flew his little private plane into the building, because I didn't know it was an actual passenger airline. And all I could think was, holy cow, I am so late for work. And so I grabbed all my stuff, rushed out the door, and because I lived in Brooklyn Heights right along the water, I had a huge view of the skyscrapers, of the towers. The first thing I thought was, I opened the door, I see all the smoke pouring out, and I was like, oh, that's a lot bigger than on TV. And then I thought, ooh, I better close my windows. And so I went and closed all my windows, and then I just locked up and went to the coffee shop. I'm in the coffee shop, and I hear people run in screaming. So I don't think, had the second plane hit? All I know is somebody ran in and said, a plane hit the towers. Everyone was like, ah! And they all rushed out, and they start running to the waterfront. And all I could think was, who cares? I'm late for work. I'm going to get in so much trouble. I got to go to the subway. And everyone's running, and I just went to the subway. We're sitting on the subway thinking, wow, this is really crowded. And then the train stopped under, I think, Cortlandt Street, which is one of the stations where the towers are. Yeah. And all these people came in. And people were talking, oh, I heard DC might be under attack or something or whatever. And again, all I could think was, I'm late for work. I was so this big thing was happening, and all I could think about was myself, because that's what I was, back then, that was my sort of mindset. And then I get to the office, and my office mate is crying, and all I could think was like, why are you crying? Like, you're being such a drama queen. I was so not sensitive back then, and then we got sent home. I stayed with a good friend. The news cycle began, and I was just very numb throughout the whole thing. I do remember my parents calling me and freaking out, and they're like, "Are you okay? Are you okay?" And I was like, "I work in Midtown. I'm very far away. I'm very safe." And it, like, everything was through this lens of like, I don't understand why everybody's being so dramatic. And then in the months afterwards, it became this grinding like awareness, because there was like the posters and the pictures everyone had posted, and like candles, and then because by the law firm I worked at, there were people who had lost people in the deaths, 9/11 deaths, and I guess Larry Silverstein was friends with one of the partners, so they decided like to be like good New Yorkers. We're gonna represent Larry and help rebuild New York, and so I became one of the litigation paralegals, and so the 9/11 just became a part of my like work day, because it was like depositions and printouts of the maps of the two towers, and like talking to architects about how does the fire affect the thing, like can it cause, what is it, one event or two, like it just became a topic that infused all aspects of my day and night, because when you're working on a trial you don't get to sleep or anything. But then there would be random moments, like I remember the next year there was like on the anniversary of 9/11 there was like a moment of silence, and then we'd have to like, we were in the middle of a deposition and someone would say like, oh, we're doing the moment of silence, and so all the attorneys would stop talking and we would just sit there like in silence, and then I would notice emotions coming up and be very confused, because I was like, why, like I'm feeling emotional but I don't understand why, and like periodically if like MTV was doing like some like sometimes they'd play music and it's like really sad music, and I feel emotional then, but then I would stuff down my emotions because I was really uncomfortable with emotions back then. And so it was very like, I just intellectualized the whole thing.
Yeah. And I think it's really interesting. Like, and now you're in this space where you write a lot about emotions and opening up around emotions and some of that stuff, right? So it's a very interesting. Looking back at the 20-something-year-old Clara who was like,
I know.
Why is this coming up? I know all this stuff is happening, but why is this coming up, right? And so what moved you into like the field of like wellness and mental health and editing, and what brought you to that space?
So I think what happened, so I would say that my editing career again began from being in Korea, and that was just like people being like, "Oh, you went to an Ivy League college, you should work and you're an English major, can you help edit some stuff?" And so the editing career was like that path. And then at the old company that I worked at, I did a lot of medical diet cookbooks, and also alternative healing like crystals and Reiki, and just by nature of working on those books, you expose yourself to a lot of stuff around, like with the medical diet books, many of them were for autoimmune conditions, and my authors would talk about how stress management and mind-body connection was a big part of healing that. And so intellectually I would learn about these things, but everything was always up here until I started going on meditation retreats. And after I had gotten my ADHD diagnosis, and I worked on an ADHD book, I remember editing and working on the ADHD book and just crying in the office. Like, it was late at night. It's like everybody had gone home. I was still in this like workaholic mindset, and just learning about how ADHD affects girls when they're undiagnosed as young children and teenagers and stuff, and how it can create anxiety and depression, the feeling of being like you're defective. I was like, oh my gosh, that's me. Nobody ever told me about this. And that kind of opened up one window. And then I decided meditation, like my authors were like, oh, meditation's great. And so I was like, maybe I should try like a meditation workshop. And I remember taking a meditation workshop specifically for people with depression and anxiety, and learning like, oh, the thoughts that we think aren't always accurate and real, in the sense that they're not always like an accurate depiction of what's happening. Like you could have these thoughts that are like I had no idea about cognitive like that term that's in CBT, the your thoughts,
Structuring?
the where it's like the like black and white thinking or catastrophizing, all that stuff. I had not learned about that, and so when I learned about it, I was like, what? Like I have spent most of my life believing everything that I think, not realizing that what I'm thinking is being influenced by my emotions, and like it's just all looping stuff. And so it was, I think, through meditation, because after that experience, I was like, all right, this meditation stuff is wild. I'm going to try a retreat, because my little sister had gone on a meditation retreat, came back, sent this long email to all of us being like, this is the best thing. It's like therapy, but like so good. And I was like, okay, maybe I should try this. And so I went on a couple of meditation retreats. I also did couples therapy with my husband because I'd also had a really traumatizing ex-boyfriend in college who was very abusive emotionally and stalked me and, did horrible things to my friends. And all of that stuff was starting to show up in my relationship with Max, my partner. And it was like, we can't keep doing this. And so in couples therapy, I learned about things like nonviolent communication and how everybody has needs, and his experience is valid to him, and I don't get to tell him how he feels, and all these kinds of things. And then when I went on a meditation retreat for women, one of the Dharma teachers talked about intergenerational trauma or ancestral trauma, and I was like, and something just clicked, and I was like, what are you talking about? And that led me on a very deep trauma healing journey for myself. And then naturally, because these topics were of interest to me at work, I started, people would, my manager would be like, all right, so there's going to be a book topic about meditation and mindfulness. Who wants to take that topic? I'd be like, I do. And who wants to take the topic about mind body healing for autoimmune conditions? Me. And then at Zeitgeist, where I work now, we have these self-help topics, and because I'm so personally interested in them, I sort of nominate myself to take them on, and I have become sort of the editor for these types of topics for our team.
Yeah, it's even hearing you talk about this, right? I can see the excitement and how rewarding it has been for you. What about intergenerational trauma and ancestral trauma kind of stuck out to you?
I think it was the idea that some of what I was feeling and grappling with isn't my fault.
Yeah.
And I had been, so my parents are Koreans, immigrants, and my dad had been orphaned at age 5 during the Korean War. And he had watched his mom and baby sister die. Or not die, but they were asked to leave a bomb shelter because she was crying too loudly. And he watched that happen. And then my mom grew up in the countryside in Korea, desperately poor. Her mom didn't have a name when she was born, because she was, back then, I guess, my grandmother, daughters weren't given names. They were just known as daughter of so-and-so. Or at least that's what my mom said. I don't know if that's actually true, but it was just, I remember my grandparents not knowing how to read and write, and when they visited us in Atlanta, they would practice writing numbers and letters over and over and over. And so my parents had a lot of trauma growing up, and they're very loving people, but it was I think the culture and just what, especially on my dad's side, what he carried, it was a lot, right? And then it showed up also in the way they raised us in Atlanta. I went to a school where it was 95% white and 5% other. And of that, half of the other were black, and then there would be these random Latinx and Asians, which would be my sisters and me. And so being Korean American in Atlanta in a very wealthy school community, when my parents were more middle class, working class, there's just a lot of stuff. And on the women's meditation retreat, when she talked about ancestral trauma, I just started all this stuff about my parents started coming up, and I just be, oh my gosh, I remember like they would say this to me and that to me, and it made me realize that they carried trauma, and that impacted the way they raised us, and I was able to feel so much empathy and love for them and compassion, but also like deep, deep sadness, because like.
Yeah.
It's just really sad, you know.
Yeah, it's the grieving too. That's the sadness, right?
Yes.
The grieving. Which it is like part of healing to kind of have that grieving in place. I had a colleague. I can't remember his name, but I was at graduate school, and in New York, and he was Korean, right? And he like changed his whole career. He was like a pastor, and I guess he had a church, and some of this stuff is very part of the Korean culture, right? And then he's like, I started to hear all this history of trauma, and he's like, I think I need to be a therapist, and he like left the church and went to school, and he was like learning to be a therapist, and he was like, this is like, I think what he wanted to do, and so I got to know a lot about like the history of Korean culture and this, and so and everything that was kind of happening, and there's a lot of like intergenerational trauma, right? And I think it's a lot that's there. How rewarding is it to kind of work on this space of like wellness, self-help, mental health area?
I think it's very rewarding for me. Oh, and I do want to add one more thing about the intergenerational and ancestral trauma thing. So another thing that I did was I did psilocybin therapy because I was having some fertility struggles, and so I was like, is the ancestral trauma or intergenerational trauma like impacting my ability to like have kids? So I had a therapist. I have a therapist, or had a therapist that I was really working with, and she happened to do psilocybin therapy like under like, because it's not legal right now, so she'd been like learning with other therapists like secretly as part of a collective. And on my very first psilocybin journey, I had the experience of like recognizing that there were these two entities that I knew intrinsically represented North Korea and South Korea, and they were passing back and forth this like black oily poisonous looking substance. Like, you take it, no, I don't want to take it, you take it, like passing it back and forth. And the message that was coming up for me was like, there is still active trauma happening with North Korea and South Korea, and like all these families and people who are split apart, and nobody talks about it. Like when I lived in Korea, I was there for 7 years. People would freak out about like, oh, North Korea is testing a bomb, but in like Seoul, like you just don't care. You're like, okay, whatever. You just like, it's suppressed. It's like pushed away or something. And the only times they talk about it is like in the news or whatever. But my dad was like, don't talk about North Korea when you're there. Everybody's listening. You're gonna have big trouble. But that there is like so much trauma in the Korean people as a whole that does not get talked about, and I'm sure it's happening in North Korea too. And I really feel like it's what drives like Korean culture is so like obsessed with like perfectionism. You have to have like plastic surgery. You have to be like perfect job, perfect college scores. Like it's so anyway. That whole thing was like a big light bulb like moment for me as well, because I was like, this is not just my own family line. I'm like literally from a group of people that are grappling with trauma, or actually not grappling with trauma. They're just using things like drinking and workaholism and cosmetic surgery and perfectionism and eating and disordered eating and suicide to cope. And it was like that was another light bulb moment. But anyway, regarding why I love working on these types of books, I find it rewarding because I think it makes me feel better to know that maybe some of these books might help people. And I really feel like so much of the problems in our world stem from unhealed trauma that drives people to make really poor decisions, and also to like view other people as threats instead of normal living human beings that deserve compassion and respect, and also like people I think people are just uncomfortable with being distressed and in discomfort, and that really makes us wind up making bad decisions too, or unhelpful decisions, I mean.
Yeah, I'm I have something to add, and I have a thought as well, and hopefully, I really try at times to like take off my therapist hat, right? But even as you talked about South and North Korea, right? It brought me back to the image of the young you in Brooklyn Heights, right? The 9/11 was happening over the river, right? Another side of the
Yeah.
river, and you're like, there's this whole thing happening, but like, I got to get to work. I can't be late to work, and this and this
Yeah.
and that, right? And you could see what's happening across the river over there, right? But
Yeah.
only thing you can like focus on is like, I can't be late, or my boss
Yeah.
is gonna be mad at me, right?
Yes,
But, like,
exactly.
the whole world was happening, right? So it's like sort of like this North and South Korea thing that was happening for you at that time. You're like, I need to get to work. I need to get to work, right? And one thing, and to kind of, I'm sort of jumping, but one thing that kind of really stuck out to me, like working with you, Clara, is that like how much you know. Like you know a lot, right? And it's not just like a intellectual knowledge, right? You knew about like therapy theories and all this type of stuff, right? But there was also this like whole body experience with it, right? You knew like what it was, and I think that was like really like for me, it was like, oh, this is like makes my job in a way way easier, right? I don't have to like explain things too much. There's sort of this already conversation that's in place that we can have. We have like the same language around some of this stuff, right? So like even like working on the book together, right? And being able to know like, oh, she has done her own work, right? She has done her own work, and that's why she has so much input, so much ways to kind of talk about these things because she has the language around it, right? This is not the first time that she has talked about this. Something came up for you. Sorry.
No, it's yeah. I try to really put myself in the reader's shoes when I edit my books because I'm highly aware that like beginner's mind is very important for readers, and I want to meet readers where they are. So, so that's part of the reason why when I do like the things that I do for myself, well, it's actually that's not why. Like I don't do this therapy work because of my job, but it's just something that because I found I continue to find so much like relief from different types of healing modalities and therapy work. I just really want readers to experience it too. So, but I also do feel like one thing my dangerous thing that I have to be worried about is I think sometimes my perfectionism shows up in how I have to do I have to heal everything and I have to be perfect in the way I heal. Meaning, it's not enough to do like I've tried so many things. I've tried ayahuasca ceremony, psilocybin therapy, meditation retreats, CBT. I have ADHD medicine. I did 2 years of IFS. I worked with a curandera, who's also a friend, who was doing like Toltec medicine work with me. I learned about DBT from like my DBT book projects, and now I'm like excited to use like some of the DBT techniques in my life. Cause it's like, at some point, am I doing this for the sake of is it because I'm not comfortable with just being where I'm at now? Like, is this a way of me like trying to like continue to like run away from like discomfort by trying to heal everything or something? Anyway, that's the one thing I would say is a danger zone that I have to be aware of. But yes, I have tried a lot of stuff, and I think it also helps that my sister is an EMDR and IFS therapist and knows about a lot of stuff too, and so I talk to her a lot.
I mean, I think it also shows how you value this work, right? And also how you value yourself, right? That you want to do this work for yourself, right? So I think that's like a huge part of it. How would you say, I know, like you also bring in like your own perspective, right? So like you are a Korean American who is an editor, right? And I know you wrote to me a little bit about like what you do at Penguin Random House, right? With the BIPOC population there. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so back when like, I don't know when it was like maybe it was during the Black Lives Matter period. There was a point when I realized like I can't do all the things. Like I can't like some people are like, okay, I'm going to focus on being all about climate change and sustainability and help promote like that kind of stuff. And then other people like, I'm going to fix sexism, patriarchy, and misogyny. And then other people are like, I'm going to fix racism things. And I'm the kind of person where I'm like, I want to fix everything because I want to be a good person, because that's, again, one of my things that I grew up with, where it's like, you have to be good. Like, my parents are super Catholic. Like, I went to Catholic school for 9 years. So this idea of like, you can't be sinful, being good is very important. Like, that is like something that I was socialized to the point where it made me, maybe it's like drives like to an uncomfortable degree. But at some point I remember being like, I can't like be up on everything, because after I had my daughter, my first daughter, I was like, watching the news was painful, because that was back when migrant children were being separated from their families and put in cages, and it was breaking my heart. And I was like, I can't look at the news. I'm like why would they do that? It was too much. And so at some point I saw something that said like, not everyone can fix everything, so pick your area and just trust that other people take their areas and they will fix it. So my sister, I have another sister who's like an environmental, she used to teach environmental stuff to like kids who are like from underrepresented backgrounds. And she's like really into the climate change environment stuff. And so I was like, all right, Teresa can do that. Cicely can be her, like, she can do the therapist stuff. I can try to, like, I'm fixated on like the BIPOC thing, because I don't want my two daughters to grow up feeling ashamed or weird for being Korean American kids. And so I was like, you know what, my thing is going to be around supporting BIPOC folks. And I can't go out to the vote and march and all that all the time, but because I also want to be a very attached parent or whatever. But I can at least try to show up in my workplace and do some work around that. And so I decided like that's one of my things. Like, I'm gonna let that be a place where I obsess. So joining POC at Pure Age was like also one of the ways that I was able to meet people in the company, because I worked fully remotely, and I joined Pure Age during the pandemic when everybody was remote. So I didn't meet people outside of my team unless it was like through random chance on Zoom calls. And so joining the POC at PRH ERG allowed me to meet other BIPOC folks at PRH. And then I joined the board because I wanted to do more. And I am the Bring Your Own Voice chair. And I think part of that is because I love that space, because I love showing up in random spaces and talking about stuff like microaggressions and how it makes us feel and everything. But I also have practiced, because I also used to do D&I stuff for my previous company. And I took a nonviolent communication class workshop thing, and a workshop on mindful communication. And so I have learned how to practice communicating about very painful topics in ways that are hopefully less triggering for some folks, and like figuring out like, how can we talk about really like hot button issues in a way that can still make people feel somewhat safe or brave or whatever, like where they're not on their heels always being defensive and stressed out. And I like the BYOV space because I get to meet other BIPOC folks at PureH, and there's a lot of really amazing people there, and they all care so deeply about these issues, and we all want to create like psychological safety in our little community, and then we talk about the stuff that like honestly like weighs on us.
Yeah, and I think it's huge to even have folks from diverse background, right, in our literature, right? So I think that's like a huge point of it, and also the things that we hold as we sort of like bringing that into like the literature. What is like one specific project that you most like enjoyed like working on? What was like the project that you really, really enjoyed?
So I always wind up really getting sucked into my book projects, like all of them. Like when I used to work on the cookbooks, my husband would joke because I'd come home and be like, all right, I think we should try anti-inflammatory eating. I think it's going to be the way to heal like a lot of inflammation in our bodies. And then like next year he'd be like, you know what, Max, I think you should try the low FODMAP diet. Maybe that'll help you with your digestive distress or whatever. And then like another time he'd be like, I've heard Mediterranean eating is really good for your heart. And so he's just like, so every time I get a new like book topic, he'll be like, oh wow, are we gonna wind up getting like I worked on a book about Reiki, and so then I wound up trying like Reiki stuff, and then so, but I will say like one book project that I enjoyed working on, mainly because I liked the author. Like I loved working on this book with you and Erica, for example, because I think you both have like such an incredible warmth that I think the readers could really benefit from. And I think this topic is so important. Like I'm trying to be a cycle breaking parent, same with my husband. And so we're like, I read this stuff and I'm like, okay, let's not do that with our kids. Like the main reason I decided to go on my trauma healing journey and fix the ancestral trauma or intergenerational trauma was not because of myself. It was because I didn't want to pass it to my kids. Because that retreat happened when I was trying to get pregnant. And so I was like, Max, I came home, I was like, we cannot pass on intergenerational trauma to our kids. But I actually, prior to working with y'all, I worked with another author on a book called Rebuilding Trust, which is a couples therapy book for couples who have gone through some kind of like trust betrayal, like traumatic event in their relationship. And what I really appreciated from that project was, so my author has ADHD. I have ADHD. But what was cool about her is because she's also a therapist who knows how to talk about these things, she was able to advocate for herself and tell me like, I have a hard time looking at these track changes. It is overwhelming me. Like, I don't know what's happening here. And like, can we do something about that? And so just working with her triggered an internal journey and process in our imprint to figure out, all right, how can we make our processes more in line with universal design, where anybody can be okay working in this way instead of just the neurotypical. And so she helped me with that piece. But in addition, her exercises pulled from multiple therapy modalities. So it was through her I learned about the vagus nerve, polyvagal theory, the window of tolerance, IFS. All these things she would like bring into her book in the different exercises. And I was like, whoa, these are some really cool ideas that I never heard about. And then that helped trigger me to learn more about these different topics. And so then when you were like, and Erica were like, oh, this could be like really helpful, like polyvagal, IFS, all that stuff. I was like, this is really good stuff. And then, and so I would say I really appreciated that project because it helped a lot.
Okay, just and to kind of end on this note, what are you reading? What?
I just finished So I love fantasy fiction because it helps me get out of the real world, I guess. And then I also like romance. So my sister was like, have you ever heard of this Court of Thorn and Roses series by Sarah Moss, which is like all over the New York Times? And I was like, no. Is it like Game of Thrones? And she's like, I don't know, but it's like selling like hotcakes. So I picked that book up. Was not thrilled with the writing quality because I thought it was supposed to be like something else. But then when I learned that it's actually romantasy, where it's like fantasy and romance combined, then I was like, oh, okay. So it's supposed to be having some of these cheesy little tropes. And then I wound up like just reading all 5 of them. I'm not going to say, I'll be honest, I was a little bit like shocked that it had been classified as young adult for a while. Because I was like, oh my God, am I going to be okay with my daughters reading this in high school? Like, I don't know. Some of these scenes are very graphic. But that's what I read. And I appreciated it for being entertaining, but also forcing me to think about, like, what is my comfort level around the kind of books I'm okay with my children reading. Because, like, I am very much in favor of free speech and not censoring books and things. But since I've had my 2 daughters, I've also been wanting to protect their childhood in certain ways, but I don't want to do it in ways that, get in the way of their autonomy over who they are and their body autonomy and spiritual autonomy and all that stuff. So it raised some interesting questions for me to like sit with. And they're only 4 and 6, so I don't have to worry about this anytime soon. But that's what I've been reading.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for sharing, and thank you for your time, Clara. Anything that you want to say? Any last thing?
No, I just want to say that I really, really enjoyed working with you and Erica on this book, and I remember reading through like the first draft of your milestones in a coffee shop near my house and like choking up during a couple of the exercises because I was like, oh my God, I could feel like if I did this with little Clara, like my inner child, like young parts and stuff, I would be so like impactful and thinking like, this is going to be so helpful. And I just hope that readers aren't too afraid to give themselves the opportunity to like heal their like wounds from childhood.
Yeah. Thank you for that, and thank you again for your time, Clara.
Oh yeah, sure. I'm happy to do this. Thank you.